Jordan. So Jordan Hill is a researcher specialising in education policy. He spent several years at the OECD Directorate for Education and Skills, working as an education policy analyst. He's also worked as a research manager in Brussels, focusing on research and innovation policy, and also as a higher education policy officer for a university association in London. So Jordan will explain his research findings in the first stage of our landmark review on boys' education outcomes across high income countries. It's the landmark report, the first of its kind, and a core part of our work looking at some of the fundamental issues affecting young men and boys, where obviously education is a key foundation. It's also going to form a crucial part of our evidence base in the Boys Education Commission, which we are hosting. And as I mentioned a couple of moments ago, the call for evidence for that will be being launched sometime by the end of the month. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over the reins to Jordan and take it away, my friend. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks for the introduction. That saves me doing the recap myself. So I'll just dive straight in about the review. So we called it a narrative review. It's been running for about 6 months now, 6 or 7 months, and it will run for about a year. I'll go into the details regarding the reports that will come out of it. So we called it a narrative review to distinguish it from a systematic review or any other types of pre-registered studies. These types of studies often have quite strict exclusion criteria. We didn't want to be exclusive. We wanted to be inclusive and keep it open and as broad as possible to synthesize and interpret a range of studies on the topic of boys' education and provide a policy-friendly overview of the existing knowledge base. Just in terms of the data sources, since it's an international review, there's extensive use of large-scale cross-sectional studies from PISA, PIRLS, TIMSS, and other international student assessments. This includes some original analysis of the published data. Just for context, the last round of PISA, for example, had over 80 countries participating and more than 600,000 students. So they're huge, and they offer us a really good way of comparing what countries are doing and how the students are performing. But obviously, cross-sectional studies are only useful for describing what's going on, and they're useful for telling us what might warrant further investigation with qualitative research, control studies, and longitudinal research, which is what the second and third parts of the review will do. Since I've only got limited time, I'll focus mainly on presenting a few charts, and I'll try to keep the text-heavy slides to a minimum, but I apologize in advance if I don't manage to do so. I think we'll take questions at the end, right, Mark? So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Questions at the end.
Okay, great. So I'll get started then. So here is the specific gap we aim to fill with the project. So we've known for many years that boys in high-income countries are more likely than girls to fall behind in school. This is most obvious in reading, but it also shows up in other areas, including dropout rates and transition to further study. However, we don't fully understand why this is the case and also, more importantly, what we can do about it. So the goal of this literature review is to develop a framework of probable mechanisms behind boys' underperformance and give policymakers a stronger evidence base for targeting their response to the challenge. And just on this bottom point, I want to emphasize again that it's an international comparative review. So the idea is to look at what's happening across the group of mainly high-income countries to see what we can learn. So here's a conceptual framework that we put together to guide the review. I'll go through it slowly because I know that it looks like a lot. So it takes a context mechanisms outcomes approach, which some of you may be familiar with. It's used quite a lot in development policy as well as impact assessments and other kinds of policy analysis. So it's made up of 3 parts. We have the context, the drivers, and the education outcomes. I'll explain each section in more detail. But I'll start with education outcomes, since that was the topic of the first report that was published a few weeks ago. The idea being that we need to understand what the outcomes look like for boys and boys relative to girls to then be able to try and explain them with the contextual factors and the drivers. So education outcomes is formed of cognitive skills or cognitive outcomes. This includes knowledge and skills, so the competency-based element, as well as higher order thinking. This is things like critical thinking, creativity, and a few other things, computational thinking as well. The knowledge and skills is more kind of like the basic core skills, so reading, writing, and mathematics. When it comes to non-cognitive skills, we look at social and emotional skills and civic attitudes. This is mainly for pragmatic reasons because non-cognitive skills are by their nature quite hard to measure. So I kind of gravitated towards the areas where there has been some significant work on the international stage and where we have a good idea of how students' social and emotional skills and civic attitudes vary between countries. Obviously, non-cognitive skills is a much broader area, but I focused on these two just because there's available data. When it comes to attainment, this is really the kind of progression and completion element. So how these cognitive skills translate to progression through the education system, as well as achievement, for instance, grades and standardized tests, teacher assigned grades, and other measures of student achievement. So if I move over to contextual factors, the idea between splitting contextual from drivers is that contextual factors have a less direct impact on the student's educational trajectories. And the contextual factors kind of operate through more student level drivers. Socioeconomic status is actually split. So you see here socioeconomic conditions in the context box. This refers mainly to kind of country income as well as local socioeconomic conditions, whereas the family and home box here in the drivers, that's family socioeconomic status. So socioeconomic status is split between the two. And that's really to emphasize the more direct impact that family wealth and socioeconomic status has on student outcomes. Moving on to the drivers, the pink box. As I mentioned before, family and home includes things like socioeconomic status, but it also includes other elements of the family setup. So, for example, how many books you have in your home, what your parents' professions are, as well as how your parents tend to support you in your education. The learning environment refers to aspects relating to mainly the classroom, but also kind of like the ethos of the school as well. Special educational needs could arguably be a contextual factor, but for boys, I wanted to put it in drivers just because, nearly twice as many boys than girls are identified as having special educational needs. So for many boys, it is in fact something that directly impacts their educational trajectory. When it comes to well-being and health behaviors, this includes things like subjective well-being, but it also includes things like physical activity, as well as health behaviors related to, for example, smoking during the teenage years, diet, all these kinds of things. And education engagement is the kind of big one. This is the kind of psychosocial aspect. So this is things looking at, for example, student motivation, how a student thinks of themselves in terms of their own capacities, as well as the behaviors that kind of result from the different motivational constructs. And there are also feedback loops built in. So you can see the arrows here. It's not a linear framework. It's a cyclical framework, kind of indicating that these factors all kind of interact with each other, and it's not a clean A, B, C kind of arrangement. Okay. So in terms of the publications, the review, as I mentioned before, focuses mainly on high-income economies in North America, Europe, Asia Pacific. It explicitly avoids mixing data from the Gulf countries who have very large gender gaps, but very specific economic, cultural, and educational contexts, making policy lessons less likely. Do you mind if I stop here for a second and just turn the air conditioning on because it's quite warm in here? I'll be like 2 seconds, sorry.
Yeah, of course. Yes. You're amongst friends, not a problem. just while Jordan's gone, if you've got any questions, we'll take them at the end, but feel free to put them in the chat as well. And also feel free to put your name and what organisation you're from. And as I said, we'll send the slides out next week anyway. Thank you.
Sorry, it's Tel Aviv summer, so okay, yeah. So as I mentioned, the review mainly focuses on high-income countries. It is structured as 3 linked reports that are published iteratively. So part 1 is the bit that's already been published. It maps the scale and nature of the gender gaps in mostly high-income countries, establishing what we know about boys' educational outcomes and what we know about them relative to girls. The second part is the contextual factors in the framework from before, and the third part is the drivers of student learning closest to boys' day-to-day experiences. We're also doing a number of country case studies that my colleague Manuela, I don't know if she's on the call as well, but my colleague Manuela is delivering. So as I mentioned before, part 1 is now done. That's published online. You can download it on the website. I think we'll also send it to you after the webinar. And I'll now present a few findings from part 1. There's the nice cover from part 1, with a very nice design and nice color scheme. It's what I call the descriptive core of the project, so what the gaps look like, whereas parts 2 and 3 are more analytical, trying to isolate those mechanisms. So here is one of the charts from part 1, and you can see it shows the average gender gap between girls and boys in terms of PISA score point differences across OECD countries. So this goes from the first study in 2000 to the latest one in 2022. This is the score of a typical boy versus a typical girl across the entire distribution. So just bear that in mind. The positive numbers, they indicate a female advantage, whereas the negative numbers indicate a male advantage. And what you can see quite clearly is that across countries, boys' literacy disadvantage is substantial, and it's the most substantial of the 3 in any direction of the three domains assessed. What you can also see is that the mathematics advantage is smaller on average in favor of boys, and it's more pronounced among, you can't see that from the chart, but it is more pronounced among the highest achieving students. So if we just zoom in on the years 2009 and 2018, so these were the years when reading was a major domain in PISA, and it has the most extensive battery of variables available. What you can see is that there was actually a decline in the size of the gap between boys and girls in their reading abilities. And on the face of it, that sounds quite positive. And actually, more than half of countries that participated in these rounds saw significant reductions in the size of the gap. However, most of this change is attributed to a decline in the average performance of girls. Boys' performance remained relatively unchanged. What's interesting as well is that countries where girls perform as well as or better than boys in mathematics tend to be the same countries where girls outperform boys most strongly in reading. So in these countries with big gaps, it suggests that there's actually it's not a domain specific challenge. It's more symptomatic of broader systematic challenges within the education system for boys. Finland is a good case study of this. People often think of Finland as being a high performing education system, but it has some of the biggest gender gaps. And actually maths, which is traditionally a domain that favors boys, girls still outperform boys in maths in Finland, and they have a huge advantage in reading. So this also shows that just because you're a high-performing education system doesn't mean you have smaller gender gaps. So as I mentioned before, reading is by far the largest gap across countries out of the 3 core subjects. It also attracts the most attention. There's a reading gap in favor of girls in every PISA country, but it is smaller than it was in 2009, mostly due to girls' poorer performance. But there are countries that buck this trend. So between 2009 and 2018, there were 5 countries or jurisdictions which saw smaller reading gaps due to improved performance of boys. If we had more time, I could ask if you can guess which ones, but we don't, so I won't do that. Here we have On the top left, it's the international average. So you can see that the gap is smaller in 2018 than it was in 2012. But as I've already said, that's mainly due to a declining performance of girls. And then the five countries or jurisdictions are Estonia, Ireland, Macau in China, Singapore, and Peru. So you see, if you compare the years 2012 to 2018, the boys' performance is significantly higher. But these are the only ones. Next slide. Okay, so moving away from reading and looking to other domains. It's also important to look at the distributional patterns. So when I say distributional patterns, I mean looking at the gaps among the weakest and the strongest performing students, rather than just the average or typical student. Because as most of you probably agree with, very few people are average. No one's average, actually. So it's really, really good to look at the distribution as well. So what you can see here, each of these boxes represents a competence that's tested by the most recent round of their respective international student assessments. So, for example, computational thinking is tested by the IEA using the ICIL's assessment. So they're all referring to different assessments by two organizations, the IEA or OECD. And it's important to say as well that there are different numbers of countries participating in these. So computational thinking, I think from memory, is about 25 countries, whereas PISA reading is about 80 countries. So just bear that in mind. The numbers you see within the boxes are standard deviation units. So basically, I've calculated effect sizes just because all the assessments use different scales. So we need a way of comparing them directly. So I don't want you to focus on the numbers in the middle, really. Just focus on the size of the boxes relative to each other and the color. The color indicates whether it's a boy's advantage or a girl's advantage, and the size indicates the relative size of the gap compared to the other competencies. I hope that makes sense. And it's for the bottom 10% of students on the right and the top 10% students on the left. And what you can see really is that among the bottom 10% of students, boys are trailing girls in all subjects, but most obviously in global competence. Global competence refers to things like intercultural knowledge, elements of critical thinking, environmental knowledge, but also in reading, collaborative problem solving. So that's solving problems while working with others. Civic knowledge, it's quite self-explanatory. Creative thinking, computer and information literacy, which may surprise some of you, that actually girls tend to perform boys by quite a big margin among the bottom 10% in computer and information literacy. If we look to the top 10%, at higher performance, the gender gaps are pretty evenly spread in terms of the numbers. They're also quite a lot smaller than among the bottom 10%. But roughly speaking, I think girls are ahead in 5 domains and boys are ahead in 6, is it? Or other way around, sorry. Other way around. But they're pretty evenly spread. So but what I would say about this is we need to make sure that even high-performing students are supported no matter what their gender is. So, if you're a boy who who wants to be really good at computer and information literacy, the fact that you're a boy shouldn't hold you back if you're talented in it. Okay, but basically one of the headline findings is among the weakest performers, boys' disadvantage relative to girls is largest and applies to every domain assessed in these international assessments. So the first report also looked at intersectional aspects. By intersectional, I mean things like how does gender interact with socioeconomic status and other aspects of student background. And this is basically to understand whether disadvantage affects boys and girls differently. So this chart shows the average reading scores of 2 types of students, native students and migrant students, across the socioeconomic spectrum by gender. And what you can see is that firstly, that socioeconomic status gaps are substantially larger than any gender gap. So it's actually important to say this. SES remains the single largest predictor of academic achievement in international student assessments, and I think probably also national analyses. And there are substantial gaps between advantaged and disadvantaged students. However, and this is not on the chart, what's interesting is that boys who are low performers tend to be a more mixed group socioeconomically than girls. Low performing girls tend to be overwhelmingly from lower SES, whereas low performing boys are from a broader range of backgrounds. At the same time, disadvantaged girls, both with and without migrant background, on average do better than disadvantaged boys. And disadvantaged boys with a migrant background record the lowest reading scores on average by far. You can see at the very bottom there. So what this means is that among girls, migration-related gaps narrow substantially at higher SES levels, whereas among boys, they persist and even widen slightly in absolute terms. So I've mentioned SES before, but it's also important to state that when it comes to reading, it's not just a poverty story for boys' education. Here you can see 4 charts that show you the percentage of boys and girls scoring below minimum reading performance. So that's on the left-hand side. And the percentage of boys and girls reaching high reading performance on the far right-hand side. Across PEARLS, which is age 10, this is at the top charts, and across PISA, which is age 15, these are the bottom charts. As I mentioned before, these are different countries, so they're not directly comparable averages, but they are a substantial number of countries internationally. At the end of primary level, the top charts there, the gender gaps in both minimum and high reading proficiency by socioeconomic status. So you can see the quintiles going from left to right, lowest to highest on each chart. The gaps are present, but they're quite modest across high-income countries. At secondary level, however, the bottom charts, boys' disproportionate risk of failing to reach the minimum reading baseline is large. You can see it's already quite large, the bottom left, in absolute terms, but actually it's most acute in relative terms among advantaged students, which runs counter to the narrative that this is purely like a low SES or a working class boys issue. And you can see there is also an advantaged student element to the high proficiency. So for high proficiency PISA students, boys' underrepresentation among high performers is most pronounced in absolute terms, so the gap is biggest among advantaged students. So it's kind of linked to the point I mentioned before. High performing and low performing girls tend to be they tend to be from a less mixed socioeconomic group, if that makes sense. But what this means really is that gender gaps are unlikely to be fully addressed by interventions targeting only the most disadvantaged boys, as advantaged boys are also more likely than advantaged girls in relative terms not to reach baseline reading proficiency. And they're also less likely than advantaged girls in absolute terms to reach a high proficiency. Okay, next slide. So moving on to non-cognitive skills. As I mentioned before, the data on this is a bit poorer compared to cognitive skills and the attainment aspects. So we looked at a small subset with the most comparative data, social emotional skills and civic attitudes. So direct assessment of these skills is challenging, but girls do tend to report skills that are more closely aligned to achievement than boys, and attitudes more closely aligned with 21st century curricula. So if we go down these points here, OECD data shows that 10 and 15-year-old girls typically report higher responsibility, higher empathy, higher cooperation, tolerance, and achievement motivation. Whereas boys typically report higher emotional control in aspects, for example, stress resistance. This is the ability to control anxiety. However, it's interesting that stress resistance was actually negatively associated with academic achievement in this specific data set. So as boys report that they deal with anxiety better, they tend to perform worse. So we have to figure out what's going on there. It could just be a feature of the assessment, or it could be something else. IEA data, which is another data set, shows that 14-year-old girls consistently express more supportive civic attitudes across different domains, including gender equality and environmental protection. So this is an emerging area of study, and actually it links quite a lot with the parts 2 and 3. So I'll go into that more when we've published the other parts. But bringing the picture back to the national level, attainment, progression, and completion. I looked at the national research and data on student performance in different standardized tests and grades. So, for example, the national examinations in England, as well as various other national examinations. And you can see that boys are substantially more likely than girls to show signs of delayed or disrupted educational progression. For example, starting school late, repeating a year, being suspended, leaving formal education early. These are not test score gaps, they're just gaps in how boys move through the system. When it comes to national examinations, they tell a similar story to the international data, PIRLS, PISA, and TIMSS. There are the widest gaps in language and the narrowest gaps in maths-related subjects. The size of the gender gap, though, and it's quite important to say, it depends how you assess it. So when you're thinking about teacher assigned grades, so whether the student is assigned a grade by the teacher in the classroom or whether they're assigned a grade by completing a standardized test, the size of the gap tends to increase for teacher assigned grades. So teachers tend to be more generous to girls. And when it comes to standardized tests, there tends to be a smaller gap. We pick up on that thread in parts 2 and 3. The automatic assumption is to jump to, oh, it's teacher biased, but actually it might just be the teacher seeing the whole of the student rather than just a specific moment in time. So there are a few different explanations for why this might be the case, but it's still important to note. So a few questions coming out of part 1 that I'll pick up on in parts 2 and 3, but I thought you might want to see. What are the specific barriers boys face in developing writing skills? Why does the literacy gap tend to widen between primary and secondary, even among advantaged students? Why does socioeconomic advantage not have the same strength of association on boys reading as it does girls? And what is the role of gender socialization in shaping boys' social and emotional skills and civic attitudes, as well as what drives boys' higher suspension rates and what are the documented consequences for their education? And finally, how do the risk factors converge across subjects for boys experiencing multiple forms of disadvantage? So that concludes part 1. I also wanted to share with you a few preliminary findings from parts 2 and 3. But just a quick caveat, these are still preliminary, so some of the data might change, some of the conclusions might change, but I think there's still some interesting things to show here. So when we look at the student assessment data, it also collects, in addition to student performance, it also collects a range of contextual information from students, teachers, schools, and parents, covering aspects such as well-being, attitudes to schooling and subjects, and a range of other things. So we looked at the responses from the students on 3 measures of school engagement at age 10 and age 15. Before I share these with you, I should just say these are different cohorts of students, age 10 and age 15, so it's not the same children followed throughout. So what we're describing here is just a cross-section. It's not tracking individual student trajectories, so just bear that in mind. So students were asked at age 10 and also at age 15 how much they enjoy reading. And this, I think, was a battery of tests. So it was an index. So I think it's about 5 questions informed the result. And you can see the number here. I wouldn't focus too much on the numbers because I've basically standardized them so you can compare them because they're using different scales. But just focus on the size of the colored line between boys and girls. And what you can see roughly is that what you can see roughly is that by age 15, the gap between boys and girls has roughly doubled. So boys are not just less enthusiastic than girls about reading at age 15. They're substantially less enthusiastic. And the distance has grown over the years of schooling between age 10 and 15. So whatever happens between primary and secondary, it isn't narrowing the gap in terms of boys' attitudes to reading. So the next gendered pattern that I thought was interesting is the mathematics confidence. Again, this is an index made of multiple questions put together. And the mathematics confidence gap actually narrows. It favors boys, so boys tend to be more confident in mathematics, but it narrows slightly between age 10 and age 15. And the final one is sense of belonging. This is where something perhaps the most striking of all three takes place. So the gap reverses entirely. So you see, but at age 10, girls report that they, on average, feel more like they belong at school. But by age 15, it's boys who report a stronger sense of school belonging. It's almost exactly the same magnitude of the gap, but it's now in the opposite direction at age 15. So again, this points to something happening between primary and secondary that affects how boys think of themselves as learners. Just for reference, the belonging scale, because it's not quite as obvious as the other two, students rated their agreement with 6 statements. So, for example, I feel like I belong at school. Sometimes I feel lonely at school, etc., etc. And they were asked, to what extent do you agree or disagree with these statements? So just to clarify. The review also looks at students' learning behaviors because these are obviously crucial to their performance. So here, for example, you can see homework time. Girls spend more time on homework in all countries that completed, I think this is PISA 2022. That might not surprise any of you, but I think it's still highly relevant. So across all 37 countries, this is in our high income filter. Every single one shows girls reporting more time on homework. It's the single most consistent gender difference in all of the data that I've examined. And the size of the gap matters as well, right? Because if you look at the scale here, typical boy in a high income country reports spending between 30 minutes and an hour on homework a day, whereas the typical girl tends to spend or report spending between 1 and 2 hours. So it's not just the sake of a few minutes, it's really a substantial amount of time that's different here. This obviously tracks to certain elements of performance, right? So the question for policymakers is, why do boys report investing less time in the academic substance of schooling? As I mentioned before, well-being is part of the framework, mainly because it's also crucial for students to be to feel well, to feel sound in body and mind when it comes to their academic performance. So we know that children from wealthier families tend to report less bullying than children from poorer families on average. But what we didn't expect really is that the protective effect of family resources operates differently for boys and girls in the data set that I've used here, which is PISA, I think. This is still PISA, yeah. So as you can see here, this is the reported bullying exposure from PISA 2022. And again, this is an index, so it's formed of, I think, 5 or 6 different questions. If you look at the 2 lines, so boys are in, which color are boys? Yeah, boys are in purple and girls are in green. The green one for girls actually slopes downwards, so they start off at a slightly higher level of bullying exposure. But by the time you get to the wealthiest girls, they're significantly lower. But boys, it's quite flat. Boys start off a bit lower than girls, but richer boys don't get bullied noticeably less often than richer boys, than poorer boys. So there's an interesting element there to explore. You know, why is wealth? Why does wealth seem to be more of a protective factor for girls against bullying, but not for boys? It's also highly relevant for interventions as well, right? Because we have a lot of literature on bullying interventions, but it often, or on whole of school approaches, anti-bullying programs, but it often doesn't recognize differences in terms of gender, and often the data isn't disaggregated. Often gender is just a control in the research process. Again, these are correlations across countries at one point in time, so it can describe a pattern, but we can't yet explain it. It's also possible that the gap reflects differences in how boys and girls report being bullied, rather than differences in actual experience. I think this is the last slide. So the last slide looks at the teaching workforce. So the argument really that's often made is that recruiting more male teachers would raise boys' achievement automatically. It's often a policy proposal that you hear. It comes up regularly in newspaper columns, in policy reports, and parliamentary debates. So what I did here was I ran a number of different regression models to test it with the international student assessment data across high-income countries. Basically, I asked the question, does having a female teacher rather than a male teacher predict how well boys do? And you can see, so these are different subjects, first of all. So at the top, you have reading grade 4. So the student is about 10. TIMS, that's maths, aged about 10. Science, aged about 10. Maths, aged about 13. And science, aged about 13. So yeah, so these are all TIMS or PEARLs. But the answer is that across 5 separate analyses covering reading, mathematics, and science at both primary and lower secondary ages, there's no real effect in terms of boys' performance if they're taught by a male teacher compared to a female teacher. The only two areas, the two effects that were statistically significant, the ones in gold here, this is maths and science, grade 4, so around 10 years old, actually point the opposite way. So boys taught by women in those grades and subjects score on average slightly higher than boys taught by men. So, and although these two are statistically significant, right, that you can see that it's in test score points, so the number is tiny actually. There is basically no difference, even though it's statistically significant. So it's around 5 to 7 score points difference. When we compare that to the kind of often found socioeconomic status gap, which is around 80 to 100 points. So really it's nil effect on all counts. So in this data set, the analysis that I did just basically argues that that recruiting more male teachers would not automatically close attainment gaps for boys. This doesn't mean that teacher gender doesn't matter at all for anything or anyone. There are other studies that point the opposite way. There could be numerous different effects on engagement, on relationships, or other outcomes. This is a narrow study, a simple analysis, but I thought it was quite interesting. And I also referenced the other literature in the review. So that concludes the kind of the results section. So although we're in the early stages, we can already start to think about the implications for policymakers. In general, I find it helpful to take a systems approach, which acknowledges the complexity of education policy and education systems and the importance of the interactions between actors. So here are the policy levels that I was thinking of. So in the middle there, we have boys, and we have obviously at the top the outcomes that are in focus. We can think about the system level. Things like tracking and selection, are students, what age are students put into different sets or different competence levels. We can think about specific support for students whose first language isn't the language of instruction. At the school level, we can think of whole of school approaches. We can think of well-being and mental health interventions and a wide range of others. When it comes to the classroom, obviously teacher education and training is crucial, as is literacy, pedagogy, and instruction, and other elements that relate to special educational needs. And lastly, closest to the student, family and home. What does the family and home situation look like? How is the home learning environment? Are parents engaged in reading? How are the relationships between boys' families and the school? And how do those differ when you think about girls' families? This is not a definitive list, and it would be great if you could give input and help to refine it. So that's the last slide. Over to you. What rings true and what doesn't against what you're seeing on the ground? Which countries do you think it would be interesting to look at for case studies and why? Which initiatives have you seen making a difference for boys' education outcomes? What does the international assessment data miss? What extra granularity can we get from other sources? Which policy levels do you find the most relevant and which policy levels are missing? And how can we avoid the deterministic argument? How can we keep the narrative from becoming zero-sum boys versus girls? And that's it. Thank you very much.